Earlier this morning, I spoke to the governor of the Bank of Israel. I spoke in a non-accusatory tone, and that would be Stanley Fischer. I asked the governor whether Israel was the new Switzerland and what the challenges are that go along with that new title.
And welcome to the Promise Podcast. That is Shacharit's Promise Podcast, brought to you by Shacharit, the think tank for new Israeli politics. Here with me today is Don Futterman, the Israel Program Director of the Moriah Fund, the Director of the Israel Center for Educational Innovation, a regular contributor to Haaretz, and a frequent blogger for Open Zion of the Daily Beast. What's up, Don?
I'm still reeling from the Super Bowl, but, starting to get back on course.
Good. Super Bowl is always big news here in Israel. And here today, as well as Elon Schwartz, who is the founding director of Shacharit, and he's also a faculty member at the Melton Center for Jewish Education at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His book, At Home in the World, is now available in paperback. How you doing, Elon?
Excellent.
Good. Now, we're sad today because Emily Silverman, unfortunately, is not with us today, and we wish that she was. And we apologize for all of those who tune in just to hear Emily. I am Noah Ephron. I'm a fellow of Shacharit. I teach at Bar Ilan, and I don't like to brag, but I was recently awarded a very prestigious Twitter account, which they don't give to just anyone. So I'm excited. But not only that, I'm in an excited state today, as I think we all are, as recent events have once again capitulated Israel into international headlines, leaving boosters gape-mouthed at the success of this spunky upstart of a country and detractors grimacing in frustration at the country's obvious disregard for international standards of probity and propriety. I am, of course, referring to arguably the two most controversial ads on the American Super Bowl. The one which, Don, one of which you saw. The one that you didn't see, Don, never appeared at all, and that was SodaStream's bold attack on Coke and Pepsi that led to the jettisoning of the ad even before it ever showed in what one might call the carbonation defenestration. It's almost as if you've heard that. It's almost as if we recorded that
Did
before.
you see the ad that we didn't see?
I have now seen the ad we didn't see on this thing called the Internet, which I managed to see it. And what they've got, the SodaStream, which is an Israeli thing. It's a seltzer maker. You make your seltzer. And every time somebody makes seltzers, then warehouses of Coke and Pepsi explode. I think that there's some symbolism there going in the ad that somehow the SodaStream is going to somehow dethrone Coke and Pepsi and Sprite and the rest from the most beloved, from being the most beloved carbonated beverages, and Coke and Pepsi being huge supporters of the Super Bowl themselves. Protested, and that ad was never seen. But, of course, the other ad was the one that you did see, and that was GoDaddy's much-discussed When Beauty Meets Brains ad that had Bar Raffaele smooching with a nerd named Walter. And that was really something. We've talked about nothing in the week since. Now, Don, when Zionist philosopher Ahad Ha'am envisioned a Jewish state as a center in which thousands of years of Jewish culture would find a modern interpretation that retained and continually renewed its authenticity, do you think that that's what he had in mind, Bar Raffaele and Walter?
I think this is much closer to Herzl's vision of a normal state like any other state, that we have the same fantasy and, in fact, the same ideal woman as the whole rest of the Western world.
Yes, Bar Raffaele, though I frankly was a little bit taken by Walter.
Well, that may be a whole separate discussion we should have off mic.
Now, today, two topics, or for our French listeners, deux topics we're going to have. The first one is the recent sudden retirement of the avuncular Stanley Fischer, the once Zimbabwean or Rhodesian, later American, later Israeli economist who is credited by some for the Herculean success of Israel's economy over the past 8 years, as he has served as the governor of Israel's bank. So what did he do? What did it mean? Why did he leave, we'll ask. And then our second topic is a thesis floated by intellectual and Professor Peter Beinart of Open Zion, a thesis that a politically weakened Netanyahu could be, quote-unquote, Obama's silver lining. Is a new era of America pressure on Israel to enter a peace process upon us? And if so, is that good? Is it bad? Or is it just complicated? But first, check this out. That was Jack in the Box. The song was Cafe Adir. Jack in the Box is one of the most intriguing and elusive and experimental of indie bands. They play toy instruments. They play instruments of their own construction, electronics of their own invention. They are cooler than cool. They are hipper than hip. And they have led us into our first topic. Stanley Fischer. Don, what is the story behind that story?
Well, Stanley Fischer was the governor of the Bank of Israel for the last 8 years. And he is a world-class economist who determined Israel's monetary policies. But he also lent his personal stature to Israel's international reputation. He comes from a background at the International Monetary Fund, at the World Bank. He was highly respected, a professor at MIT, before he came to Israel. And I think, one of the contributions he made during this period, and remember during this time, Ariel Sharon was suddenly incapacitated as prime minister. We've had wars and battles with Gaza. Was he calmed the international investors down. He said, I'm at the helm, things are okay. And I think that was, in addition to his policies about which there's some debate, that was an enormous contribution to Israel's status in the world. And in fact, in 2010, the Bank of Israel was rated the most efficient and effective central bank in the world on one of the important international barometers. The main job of the Bank of Israel is to maintain low inflation, manage foreign currency exchanges, try to create and then try to maintain financial stability. He determines the monthly interest rate, which is probably the most direct tool that he has to doing these things. And overall, most people think he was very successful. 2012 ended with low inflation of 1.6%. Bank reserves are high. The foreign currency exchange rate is pretty stable. Fischer intervened in the foreign currency market. He's known to have protected military spending, took an active role in keeping the banks clean, most notably in helping to push out Donnie Dankner as chairman of the Bank of Poalim, which was very controversial how he was using the bank. He also managed to pass a new Bank of Israel law, which reduced the power of the governor, and there's a 6-person committee that makes a lot of the decisions that in the past the governor would have done. So there's more checks and balances built into the system, and especially if Fischer's not going to be there himself to make the decisions, he trusts they'll make better decisions with a committee than one person. So where are the demurrals? Where are the questions? Well, several commentators have pointed out that he didn't sound the warning alarms loud enough about the government's unrealistic fiscal projections in the last 2 years. Some of our listeners may know that Israel is now looking at a 40 billion shekel deficit. That's more than $10 billion, which in a state this size is astronomical. And there are serious disagreements about whether his role in the whole housing market, which again, if we go back, triggered the social protest, whether what he did was helpful or destructive. He kept interest rates low, which meant a lot of people went out and started buying apartments. On the other hand, as Professor Yaron Zelicha, who became famous during the social protest for his YouTube videos, which explain the economy, as he pointed out, he's one of Fischer's critics, this also brought the money speculators into the housing market, driving prices up even higher. And they have a lot more money, a lot more clout than all those young couples and their parents who are trying to buy their first apartments in Israel. He was also criticized for spending too much money buying dollars to keep the shekel low, and Israel now has to pay off the loans the bank took to keep to buy that money. So overall, looking back, there's some questions about why he's really leaving now. Is he abandoning a sinking ship? He doesn't want to try to deal with the mess that's been created. Some critics say he's really sick of the Netanyahu government, both because of its economic policies, which he thinks have been irresponsible in the last couple of years specifically, and because of their blocking the peace process, which he thinks would bring enormous stability. I'll just end with one little point here. Fischer said that Israel can continue growing with or without peace. Without peace, 4% a year. With peace, up to 6% a year. And he said the difference between 4% and 6% is not 2%. The difference is 50%. So that means the growth rate would be another 50% higher. That would have an enormous impact on our economy. So that's a lot of background. So let me ask you guys, what do you think? To what degree does the current crisis result from his policies? Is his legacy overall going to be positive or destructive? And where do we go with the next government that we're looking at?
So Fischer, it's interesting over a very stormy period, I think, in certain ways in politics. I guess every period in Israel is politics, but he's like a rock. He's incredibly popular in Israeli society. A little bit surprising why he was so popular, but truthfully, in like reports that would be put out about who do you have the most trust in that's in a public position, he would rank in one of the top, if not the top person for years already. He's been in office now for 8 years, I believe.
8 years
since he was brought in. I have a personal affinity towards him because he's one of ours, and like that's a nice little thing. I think he grew up in Rhodesia, but I think went to the States. I think at a relatively young age, and he was involved in Habonim. He was like a Zionist youth movement kid. Met his wife in Habonim. I think he was on Habonim Workshop,
right.
The gap year in between high school and college, if I'm not mistaken.
He knew Hebrew.
He knew Hebrew. Part of the Hebrew was from that. He did Ulban, like the whole thing. So he's very proud of it. But it's a little curious because he's extremely connected ideologically to Netanyahu's kind of economic kind of world. He was brought here on a personal request by Netanyahu. I believe that Netanyahu was his student at MIT years and years and years ago. They kept contact with one another. I might be making that up completely, but I don't think so. And he was a professor of economic policies, and he was brought to Israel to basically implement or be a partner in the implementation of Netanyahu's economic policies himself. Netanyahu at the time was finance minister of the country when he was brought in, I think.
That's right, under Sharon.
And I would say, I'll just finish that point, I would say that the little that I understand about these questions is that Fischer did a spectacular job implementing fiscal policies that are essentially neoliberal. Like, that's his spot, that's his place. He did it well. The country basically did well economically. We can talk about what we mean economically, by doing well. Certainly the social protests have a lot to say about what that means, doing well. And I think a lot of the finger can be put to Fischer. But that was that. In the model that he was in, and that's also the criticism that maybe I'll develop a little bit later, in the model, he's the best that model gets.
Well, that's the thing. I think you're exactly right. He was almost universally referred to as, quote unquote, the responsible adult of Israeli politics and Israeli economy. He was viewed as being someone who was above the political fray, who was not motivated by politics. And in some ways, I think he was viewed across the spectrum as being somehow devoid of ideology himself. But you pointed out what I think is a great paradox of the guy is that he was in some ways, all ideology, and his decision, for instance, to keep interest rates so low promoted consumption. I mean, it made no sense to keep money in the bank. It has made no sense to keep money in the bank here for the last decade, more or less. Certainly for his 8 years, interest has been so very, very low. I know this is not unique to Israel, but people seeking places to invest their money have invested in the housing market that's caused housing prices to more than double in the course of his tenure, and they've also spent it on all sorts of things. So we have become a consumerist society, in part because the monetary policy made that really the most rational way to be.
Doesn't make sense to save money.
Well, Zalicha's argument says that Fischer's intentions may have been to do what you're saying, but the consequences were actually the opposite. That by driving apartment prices up so high, you damaged a central portion of the consumer market, and consumption actually went down. Because all those people, all those thousands or tens of thousands of young couples and their parents, who are the only ones who can actually come up with enough money for them to buy an apartment, had to redirect most of their resources to overpriced, inflated apartment costs, and then couldn't use that money to buy anything else. So he's saying that this actually is driving Israel into a recession, and that Fischer's policies, it's not a question of neoliberal, not neoliberal, he's just mistaken, that the outcomes are the opposite of what he wanted. And Fischer himself acknowledged that part of his very generous low-interest policy ended up causing the apartment bubble. Now, when you have an apartment bubble, there's a problem because everyone who has an apartment then becomes a stakeholder in keeping prices high, and nobody wants the bubble to pop because they don't want to lose. They don't want to lose it in their wallet. I mean, it's okay if the bubble pops the day after I sell my apartment, but not the day before. So he said that's a dynamic that's very, very problematic. And it excludes a large portion of the population. Now, look, during this period, the gap between rich and poor in Israel grew. It didn't shrink. I think that's another thing that has to be looked at and questioned. And I don't know how directly his policies affect those things.
The whole policy is directed, essentially. I mean, we know what the policy looks like. It's fairly well known. It's a trickle-down economy. At the end of the day, it benefits the wealthy. Taxation is considered as something that ultimately it kind of retards the economy, and the fact that there's not enough money to go around, particularly those people that have the money, and so it doesn't demand high taxation, particularly from the upper echelons of society. It was clear there was that. It led to the huge growth of the gap between the rich and the poor in the country, and all of those are his legacies as well. It's part of the policy. It's part of the way it works. They think that can close the gaps, but empirically we see that it doesn't.
So let me ask you this. This question just came to my mind listening to you right now. But what do you think accounts for the gap between his policies and the way in which he's perceived? Because over the last several years, I mean, again, most dramatically in these social protests, but also in a much broader sense, then we've seen a growing frustration and dissatisfaction with Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberal policies, and yet he does, in some ways, to have been a very crucial figure in advancing that policy, and we love him.
Well, I think it's the gap between how he's seen on the international stage and the impact that he's had there, which has been incredibly positive for Israel's standing in the world. I mean, considering we're a nation in conflict, and we've had 3 violent conflicts during his period in office, our standing, our ranking in the world has been very, very good. We haven't been hit with ranking which would hurt our economy and would probably lead to inflation and other problems. So he's done just his presence, let alone his policies, just his reassuring presence has played a very central role. I think at home, I don't believe trickle-down economics works. I think it's been discredited, and it's tragic that Israel is following a model which has been discredited elsewhere. So there, I think we have a very big problem in what he's doing.
I think that there's also other pieces to this about his popularity that are out there. I think on the center left, as Don pointed out in his introduction, he has kind of this leftist bend to him about the peace process, right. About kind of recognize. So there's a certain sympathy towards him from those that would theoretically be the most critical. I mean, my piece of that is it points out exactly how the left is overemphasizes kind of the peace agenda and underemphasizes the economic agenda, because kind of they gave him a free ride in many ways because of the fact that he was a little bit on the sides considered a darling of those worlds, and a little bit of a voice of reason or the responsible adult on those issues as well that are there. And the other thing that I was going to say about the economic side of it is that, look, there's clearly an economic critique that exists in this country, and that economic critique was deepened significantly during the social protest movement. But the critique is not an intellectual one and not an academic one. It's the way it's presented. It's the way that it's put out there. And Fischer himself, by the way, came out about the social protests mildly in favor of them. He didn't as opposed to some more crass critics of what was going on around there. And I think that we saw it in the elections as well. Yair Lapid, who is essentially from the same cut economically of that Fischer is a product of the social protest movement. That's what got his votes. And so the social protest critique doesn't get translated into a deep critique of the neoliberalism, the softer kind of the compassionate conservatism that, George Bush sold during his day. I think that plays okay in Israel.
The question is, how do you translate that into policy without just becoming an economic populist, without starting to overspend or offer dramatic benefits to the public that they want, that they're happy to get, but which the government can't really afford. And I think that's also Fischer's place, that he is against that kind of economic populism and is scared that that's what the next Netanyahu government is going to do, that they're going to resort to that and actually deepen the deficit.
Well, if you'll excuse a moment of log rolling, one of the things that Shacharit is trying to do as a think tank is exactly to translate that popular dissatisfaction into a more full, rich language that becomes an actual critique that people can, to give body and soul to that now intuition that left by itself can live alongside a neoliberal like Stanley Fischer. I would also say that I think it's yet another example, and you mentioned Yair Lapid, and in the past we've talked about this as an example of the really, for me, terrifyingly passionate lust that we Israelis feel for integrity. Man, all you have to do is be a public figure who has the look and feel of integrity. And by the way, I don't want that to suggest that I think Stanley Fischer does not have integrity. I also believe that he's a man of enormous integrity, and he seems to have a moral center. He always sounds the same as he sounded before. And I just think that the appeal of that, almost no matter what you're saying, I mean, including Naftali Bennett, even if you don't like their politics, the appeal of that integrity is so huge, and it's worrisome to me. I mean, I think it's worrisome because I think it comes partly from our misunderstanding, our overestimating the lack of integrity of other Israeli officials, but also that I think can lead to dangerous places in some ways. I mean,
well, I'll just wrap it up. I think he's been talked about as a candidate for Israel's presidency when Shimon Peres retires, and he was asked directly if he would consider being the finance minister in the next government, which is going to have to deal with this enormous deficit, and he said absolutely not. And he was asked if he would consider being foreign minister or president, and he answered diplomatically, said the offer hasn't been made yet.
I heard him say in an interview that a wise governor of a bank never says never about those offers. So I don't believe that he will be our next foreign minister or president or economic or minister of finance, but we'll have to wait and see. And with that, let us turn back for just a moment to Jack in the Box. That was ready, and now we are ready to move on to our second topic. And our second topic is, I think, an interesting, perhaps outraging thesis put up forward by Peter Beinhard. Elon, what's the story behind that story?
Well, I would say that there are two different stories or two different pieces to this question. A new government, and anytime a new government comes in, you have questions as, okay, what does it mean in terms of our relationships with the Palestinians and how to understand that? And particularly this election, which shook things up in a way that I think surprised most pundits of Israel, particularly the Yair Lapid rise to, being the second largest party, winning apropos, the middle class vote, winning kind of the upper middle class vote, winning much of the Ashkenazic vote, winning the secular vote, going through the various constituencies that played to him. Where does he stand on this, and what opportunities are open and not open according to this? Now, Peter Beinhard, in an article that appeared in the Daily Beast, basically made an argument that I've heard in several different places, not only from Peter, which basically argues that this opens up, as he called it, the silver lining, a certain opportunity. He didn't want to exaggerate what that opportunity might be, but a reason to hope that that basically Netanyahu has been weakened by this, and that weakening along with the Lapid rise, opens up possibilities for an American government to be able to put pressure on particularly Obama, second term, be able to put pressure on Israel in ways that it hadn't been able to put pressure, and that Israel remains vulnerable to that happening. And that assumes a couple of things that need to be put on the table. That assumes that the obstacle to peace is clearly Netanyahu and the Israeli government. It assumes that pressure on Israel is the thing that is going to be able to shake that and open those possibilities up. And so a question that I wanted to kind of throw out back at you guys is, does this government, in fact, we don't know what the government is going to be yet exactly, but are there openings here that didn't open up before? And where do those openings come from? Do they come from the possibilities of pressure from the outside, as Beinart was arguing? Does it attest to changes on the inside, and what's the dynamic between those two things? So I'm open.
Well, I think first of all, it definitely does open up the possibility of pressure from the outside, like Beinart suggested. I don't think that there's any question about that. But I find myself very ambivalent about that. I've got the angel on the one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder, and I don't really even know who is whom. But on the one hand, as somebody who is extremely frustrated by the stagnation of the peace process and feels that Israeli leaders have at least a serious part in causing that stagnation, though they are not the single cause of it. It seems that I'm hungry for anything that can break that logjam, and it seems like maybe pressure from the outside is could make that difference, and I feel myself longing for it. But on the other hand, I do not really believe in the long run that the solution to this problem can come through arm twisting, and so I guess at the end of the day, I feel like a weakened Israeli government that can be forced into doing something is not going to produce a settlement that is sustainable.
Well, I think we have to separate the issues out, because I think there is one issue is, what is the strategy of the American administration, the Obama government, in trying to move Israel towards some serious peace negotiations?
That's nice that you think they have a strategy.
Well, they had a strategy last time, which was disastrous, very damaging. I think these were among Obama's major mistakes of his entire first term. The Bafo mistake was to talk as if there was already an agreement on a settlement freeze before he had achieved any such thing with the Israeli government. I think his second huge mistake was not making any kind of direct appeal to the Israeli people, which, from what I'm reading, he's already planning to come to Israel and to try to talk past the government to the nation to try to see if he can rally some support for moving. I think that in the past, arm twisting has produced some results and has also produced some backlash. It depends on the circumstances, because certainly Netanyahu has used throughout the most recent administration, he used American pressure to his own advantage. He used that to show that we were being pushed to do things that we don't want to do by the Americans, and the Americans have the Palestinians' interest at heart more than Israel's, which is completely absurd and mind-boggling that Israelis are stupid enough to buy that line. But not only did they buy it, much of the media bought it for the first 2 or 3 years of the Obama administration. I think that's one whole set of issues, is what can America do to try to move something forward. The second set of issues, which is a different set of issues, is what can the Israeli government do, and who is the Israeli government going to be? Very interesting to me is that a lot of articles that I've been reading since the election are talking about the government after the government that's being formed right now. And I can't remember that happening, that people starting to talk about after this government falls, which everyone assumes is going to happen before the 4.5-year term is up. After this government falls, we might have a new government that's more amenable to making peace. And here I feel like there's some fantasy being hitched to Yair Lapid, as if it's a done deal that Yair Lapid is going to succeed now and he's going to be the next prime minister, and then we'll have a government that's going to be really center-left, and everything will be different then. That, to my mind, is, putting the cart way, way, way ahead of the horse. We have no idea what Lapid's going to be able to accomplish in this government yet.
What he wants to accomplish in the government,
it's not
it's not clear.
Well, I think you can see what his agenda is from his campaign, what he outlined, and we'll see if he's able to implement it. It's not 100% sure he's going to even be in the government, because some noise that Netanyahu is making suggests he may be trying to pull the same maneuver he did with Tzipi Livni.
One thing I wanted to point out, I think that Peter in his article suggested that it was American pressure in part that explains why Netanyahu fared so poorly in the last election, and I just wanted to say that seems to me to be simply not true, or at least I don't see.
You're being polite when you're saying simply not true. I think it's. No, Don, you're making faces.
I don't think that Israelis vote based on what Obama said, but I think the argument that Netanyahu is ruining our relationship with the United States did push some people over to Yair Lapid. I think some of those centrists. Really? I think a lot of people in this country understand that the United States is our single, only, and most central ally, and is the life support system for this country.
It's such a. There's something to that conversation, but it loses complete context. I think that the vote in this country was a vote, among other things, a vote against the ultra-right wing. And I think that was a lot of what happened in the vote. I think if you look at what it was Netanyahu's supporters, a lot of them the liberal Netanyahu supporters that shifted and went. They considered Bennett for all sorts of reasons, large proportions of those that ultimately went to Lapid. So these were not center-left people by and large, although it got some center and center-right that went there. And I think it was a center-right. There was a vote both about the economic issues for sure, and also just like that general malaise of where the country is going, which the relationships to the United States certainly plays a role in that, but it's not kind of the card that's the central thing in the way that people are thinking about things. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, wouldn't you have expected, because I expected, when Obama started talking, or they released that Jeffrey Goldberg interview where he talked about how little he doesn't trust Netanyahu. All I can think of is, oh my God, they're playing right into Netanyahu's hands again. He's going to take this and show all of his followers that we have to stand up to America, and his constituency loves the idea that little Israel is standing up to America, loves the idea that we're standing up to anybody, makes them feel good, or at least that was the idea. But then his numbers went down,
exactly,
so it didn't follow the script.
But I'm just saying that's all I'm saying is that's part of a larger tapestry. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying to isolate it as if this is about what Obama said. Obama has no popularity in Israel whatsoever across the board. I mean, he's at 16% or something ridiculous like that. But that general angst of where we are in the world, of where we are to ourselves, about seeing some of these politicians that have been very vocal and very, very aggressive from the ultra-right that have been there the whole time, I think it was a vote against that stuff. And I think that's where it pulled it back into it. It's the thing that frustrates me about Beinart's position is that I think it puts the focus on how to move the peace process forward into the wrong place. It puts how to move the peace process forward into the place of Israel's the obstacle. We've got to put pressure on them. The way that we're going to put pressure on is through Obama's second term, and we've got to move that forward. And that's where it is.
So if you're an American Jew, say suddenly you're elected the head of either J Street and AIPAC that have just joined together, and what do you think the right strategy is? Or the right framing of that issue.
But I think that's who Beinart's targeting. His readership.
But by the way, it's not you,
American
Don,
Jews.
Who's the head of AIPAC/J Street. It's Elon.
No, I know. I'm just saying that I think
he'll hire you.
No, he won't. But I think that Beinart is actually targeting those. That's who he's actually reaching out to, is those J Street followers and other people, and saying, You have to change your tactics too, because what you did in the last 4 years wasn't effective, and now
I think
maybe
he's saying now's a chance where we can pressure Obama to pressure Netanyahu.
Well, also because Obama's taking his own restraints
off. Second term,
but Obama feels more liberated.
Netanyahu is weak, and this is the situation that we're waiting for.
It is the head movement of looking for help from behind us and not looking forward at Israeli society.
So what should it be?
I think, first of all, they should be making contacts all over the place with people like Lapid Lapid and all of those kind of people that come in the new Chevre Knesset and everything about that, number one. Number two, thinking that the obstacle to this thing is only Israel, I am sorry. That is one of the categoric mistakes of this thing. I want to take a politician like Dan Meridor, because Dan Meridor, I think, is incredibly important in analyzing what happened here. Meridor, right-wing, light, revisionist tradition, strong kind of Jabotinsky kind of liberal values of, civil society and the place of all of those things, strong sense of democracy, all of those things.
In the Likud.
In the Likud, that was there. Left the Likud to join the Merkaz Party, basically because of the frustration of the fact that he thought that was going into wall, and rejoined the Likud. And rejoined the Likud, I believe, because he became convinced that the Palestinians weren't ready to make peace. And therefore, he joined the Likud back around that. That question sits deeply in Israeli society. And if I was J Street in AIPAC, I would not only be reaching on the Israeli side of this. This is an opportunity that the Palestinians need to grab hold of as well. And we need people that are not going to put the burden only on Israel in terms of this stuff. We need people that are going to say, guys, there's an opportunity here. If both sides are interested in this, let's figure it out, and let's figure out where the obstacles were. Now, I've a stomach full about what Netanyahu has done and not done. He has not convinced me that he was at all committed to peace in any way. It was such an easy thing to do, to go to the settlers movement and join on, because there's no partner. We have to know there's a partner. We need to do everything in our power that we come ready for a partner to join us.
I agree. By the way, I would call it JPAC. I'm just working this out. JPAC, I think, is the name of this.
Or A Street.
But that would be good too.
Or Pack Street. Anyway,
I'm still worried about carbonization, defenestration.
Defenestration. Well, I think that actually may be the direction we should all be thinking. Look, if I go back and look at the Obama administration, I think they did a lot more pressuring of the Palestinians than Israelis want to acknowledge. If you look at what was going on behind the scenes,
not pressure.
No, but the Palestinians.
Pressuring the Palestinians to come to the table, for them to be ready. We have a fundamental issue. They have a fundamental issue, which is their leadership is divided. There's two different, very ideologically opposed leaderships in the West Bank and in Gaza. Abu Mazen, I think, for all the charges and complaints against him, has been quite surprising to me, to the degree to which he has stopped violence as a tactic and embraced a different approach. I think going to the UN, I know our government's against it, but that is an example of a nonviolent diplomatic maneuver. Now, yes, he's trying to use all the power he can to harm our country's standing, to force us to come to the table, but I prefer all these methods to terrorism. So I say, do we have a partner? I think we have a problematic partner. I think they have deep internal problems themselves. I think they have a very problematic partner in us. And during the Netanyahu administration, I think their assessment had to have been that they didn't really have a partner for conversation, because all the government was interested in doing was expanding settlements. So I think, is that going to change now? It might change. If you have Naftali Bennett in the coalition, is there a chance that we'll move towards any serious negotiation? That would seem kind of doubtful on the face of it, but anything can happen. Once you're there, Ariel Sharon is the one who took us out of Gaza. Once you're in power, sometimes people's views change. I don't expect that from the Jewish Home Party to happen. That would be quite shocking to me if it did. But yes, I think the rules of the games have changed, and maybe the commentators are right when they say, let's start setting the stage for the next government after this one, and maybe then something will happen.
And by the way, his physicians reported this past week, that Ariel Sharon had showed really shocking, remarkable brain activity for someone who has been in a coma for all these years, that many had said that they'd never seen anything like it. So, Don, do I understand you to be saying that you believe that Ariel Sharon is going to come back and do this?
Well, I would be interested to hear what he thinks about what's going on.
That news story was creepy beyond belief.
It was unnerving.
The whole
thing
was
completely unnerving.
But
I don't really like that borderland between life and death and the next.
Well, and I always just feel bad for his children. But my last word that I have to say about this is that I also, by the way, think that Peter's article is a misunderstanding of Obama's nature as well. I don't actually think that Obama is going to be this Dick Cheney, let's just power politics, let's push him around. I don't think
Nor
that's
John
the
Kerry
mettle of that
likely
man.
to be, the new Secretary of State likely to lead that kind of a line.
That is correct.
And with that, we can move on to our What a Country segment. Now, our What a Country segment is a segment in which each of us describes something that charmed and enchanted, surprised them over the course of the last little while as we wended our way through our lives here in Israel. Don, what is your What a Country?
I want to talk about the novelist Yochi Brandes. Yochi Brandes is a phenomenon. She grew up in a Hasidic family of some renown. She's the daughter of an Admor, which is someone with a community leader of great status. She left her Hasidic roots and has quite a personal journey, which you can actually find an essay in English on the internet that she wrote, which is quite moving. But she didn't abandon Judaism in either her teaching or, more significantly for her community of readers, as a writer. She's written 7 novels and 1 book of essays. And I would say she is unique in answering the call of modern Jewish and Israeli culture that somehow fulfills part of the Zionist mission, which is to address our sources, to go back to our Jewish sources, both Tanakh, the Bible, and the Talmud, and address those stories and reframe them, retell them, relate to them in the context of our lives. So take our national literature and bring it alive. Malachim Gimel, the 3rd book of Kings, she kind of continues where the Bible leaves off. But it's actually fascinating because she tells the story of King David from the other side, from the side of the kingdom of Israel, which was destroyed, rather than from the kingdom of Judea, which was David's side, who, being the winners and the survivors, are the ones who presumably wrote the stories. So it's a brilliant counter-narrative to the Bible and continues the story. I won't be giving much away by saying that King David is the villain of the novel, because you find that out fairly quickly, and that his first wife, Michal, who he abandons for the most part, she was the daughter of King Saul, Melech Shaul, is a crucial presence throughout. Her most recent novel, HaPardes Shel Akiva, Akiva's Orchard, she takes on, and this is how she described it in a talk that I heard recently, which my nephew Itamar, who loves her writing, took me to hear her at the conservative synagogue, conservative shul in Modi'in. And she described this as trying to put in a novel the revolution of rabbinic Judaism, the creation of Judaism as we know it today. Because as she said, the Judaism we live isn't biblical Judaism. It's the Judaism created by the rabbis, somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. Everything that we do as Jews today grew out of that. And so, the Israeli way of trying to skip that and go back to just the Bible misses what Judaism has been about for the past 2,000 years. So this book relates to everything from early Christianity to the completion of the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings we say at the heart of all of our prayer services, the competition between the rabbis pulling in different directions from the schools of Hillel and school of Shammai. But she hangs her tale on a central figure in Jewish history, Rabbi Akiva, who's considered at the time the greatest Jewish thinker since Moses, since Moshe. He was a shepherd and famously began to study Torah only at the age of 40, married Rachel, the daughter of a wealthy man, against the father's wishes and was cut off. And then she sent him off to study and become a rabbi and didn't see him for many, many years, 12 years or 24 years, depending on which part of the story. Now, as former members of Garin Pardes, those of us in this room once belonged to a Garin to form a new community here, which was named after the story of the 4 rabbis who entered the Pardes, the orchard, which is a euphemism for entering a higher mystical truth or paradise. And as the story says, 4 went in, and when they came out, 1 rabbi died, the 2nd went mad, the 3rd became an apostate, and of the 4, only Rabbi Akiva came out unscathed. Now, she actually answers the question of what happened to the 4 rabbis inside the orchard. And I will say, her answer is specific. It's not mystical blah blah. It's not fluff. It's very concrete, very specific, and ingenious, and very, very troubling. So it's worth reading the book just to get to that vision of what actually happened in the Pardes. I would highly recommend Yochi Brandes. Her work has not been translated into English, possibly, as she said, because it's the challenge of being able to translate prose in a novel. And her prose is kind of like almost pulpy, like reckless speed. Everything's very dramatic. I think it would make a great graphic novel, by the way. But to find people who can understand the sources and get the nuances of the sources, the texts, into her novel and translate the prose, so far nobody's been able to do that. So if any of our listeners are out there feeling they could pick up the task of translating her books or turning them into graphic novels, I would say get Malachim Gimel or Pardes Shel Akiva and get to work.
Sounds great, Don. Elon, what's your Vada country?
Every Saturday afternoon, I go up with my family and meet my brother and his family at my mom, who lives in Netanya, which is halfway between where my brother lives and I live, and we get together. And my brother is married to Racheli, who is an ex-kibbutznikit from Kibbutz Urim. And so this past Saturday we had a really powerful conversation as a result of a documentary that my wife and I had watched on video on DVD the other night. A documentary called Children of the Sun, Yaldei HaShemesh, which was done in 2007, which was a documentary essentially about the experience of kids growing up in what was called Lina Mishutefet, right? Joint, well, how would we translate that? Kind of growing up in children's houses and not in the homes of their parents. And it was an enormous social experiment that was out there. And this was really part of a whole series of newfound interest about what we'd call the demise of kibbutz, or the slow disintegration of the kibbutz idea. Another movie that was out there, a drama, very popular, equally fascinating, called Adama Mishugat. 2 books, one which was called Hayinu Ha'atid, We Were the Future, and then my favorite of the series, a book called Habaita, which was about kibbutz afikim, which basically was a mix between going through the archives of the kibbutz and a drama about the heyday and then the slow disintegration of the kibbutz. And all of these together put together this kind of new interest in kibbutz and what had been there. And getting Racheli's take on all of this, which she had drunk it all up, knew the books, knew the movies, had watched the documentary, was very interesting. Particularly Children of the Sun gripped me for its, on the one hand, very powerful and painful view, both on the psychological level of kids growing up in children's houses, away from their parents, kind of some poignant stories about a child who wanted to be with her parents at night, who would sneak out of the children's house, hide in between the trees, and finally make its way to their parents' door, but not go in because they knew that their parents would ultimately take them back home. But the movie, the documentary, as this entire literature points out, is bittersweet. It's sad about what had been, but it's also got a deep appreciation for what had been. And it reminded me, and this I'll end with a conversation I once had with Muki Tzur, kind of like the iconic kind of storyteller of the kibbutz movement and the second Aliyah, which he once said, people smile too much when they hear about the difficulties that our kibbutz are having, as if they get pleasure out of the fact that this didn't exactly work. And Muki's vision was that there's something deep within this that can be reborn in Israeli society. And I think the social protests actually came out of that same tradition. And today in Israel, for those who don't know, maybe I'll talk about it in another What a Country, there are tens of intentional communities that exist in all sorts of towns and cities in Israel today. And they all see themselves as part of that experience. So it's changed from the kind of almost Stalin-like picture that Children of the Sun gives you of what was growing up on kibbutz in the 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s. But I think that real human side that the story tells us about trying to make the world a better place still very much lives here. And so that bittersweetness can still have a happy ending.
That's lovely, Elon. And I also adore this movie, and I recommend that you go to Netflix and take it out, Children of the Sun. My What a Country, well, I don't know whether to begin at the end, at the beginning, or in the middle. So beginning at the end, a couple of years ago, somebody wandering the streets of Tel Aviv on Rhinus Avenue looked into a trash can and saw this book and a manuscript of some sort, and they couldn't quite figure it out, but it seemed to them to be important, so they took it from the trash and wandered around and asked people what it was. Nobody knew, and somebody had the wherewithal to send them to Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem, they immediately identified this book as the guest book of the Penis Pension in Rome that operated from the 1920s until 1941 in Rome. So that's the end of the story. The beginning of the story, it begins with Yitzhak Eliyahu Penis, who was born in 1883 in Belarus, and then escaped Belarus, escaped the pogrom, and wandered his way around Europe, finally making his way to Rome, where in 1922 he opened this pension. And the middle of the story is that for those 19 years, the pension was open from 1922 until 1941, when it was closed by the fascists. This pension was the only religious Jewish kosher pension in Rome. And so this guest book has everyone that you could imagine, in every Jew that you could imagine in Europe, signed it in one form or another, so that Yosef Berg, who is the father of Avram Berg, who was Speaker of the Knesset, and his father was the head of the National Religious Party and a long-term member of Knesset and minister, passed through in 1939 as he was traveling through Europe trying to get certificates into the hands of Jews so that they could emigrate and escape the Nazis. He stopped there and fell in love with Penis. Great Jewish writers and poets, when people passed through Rome, they would always stay with Penis. A writer named Augusto Segre, who wrote a memoir that's called Memories of Jewish Life from Italy to Jerusalem, described Penis as being someone who could identify from your looks as you walked in the door what language you spoke, and he would speak to you in your language. And he writes, I'll read a little bit, he writes, Penis was a true chacham, a true wise man, a skillful expert on the Talmud and on all Jewish ritual. He was very helpful to me whenever I turned to him to interpret texts that were difficult for me. His Italian was not always completely comprehensible, but his explanations were very detailed and useful. He was very pleased when, after dinner, he could spend a few hours training me in the actual lessons from various study materials, which were not always easy for me. So the image of Jews coming in this period of upheaval in Europe and finding themselves in Rome and having a home with this man who spoke every language but no language well, and where they would find themselves cracking open the Talmud after dinner in this pension, is very moving. And then the story of this book is that the family went into hiding with the rise of the fascists. As the Nazis came into Rome in 1943, they hid. And they survived the war, and they moved to Israel, moved to Tel Aviv, put the stuff in their boydom, which is the little kind of attic room that apartments have. It was forgotten when they sold the apartment. The new owners came and just took everything out and put it in the trash. And this was saved in sunny Tel Aviv, a beautiful and kind of stark reminder of an entire world left behind, in a world that we still have 1,001 connections to. So that kind of charmed and enchanted me. And that brings us to the end of the Promise podcast for this week. We would like to thank the Kicha Studios here in Florentine, South Tel Aviv, not so much for being on time as for the great atmosphere they provide with the faint smells of what is surely medical marijuana. It's got to be medical marijuana, I'm sure. And for being so damn cool, it's a great place to be. We'd like to thank Hashibolim, our favorite band from Kibbutz Geva, who give us the music at the beginning and at the end of every show. Look them up. Buy their album. They're great. We'd like to thank Jack in the Box and beg you, Jack in the Box, finally to come to a recording studio. We know that you believe in live music, but come to a recording studio like Kicha say, with its faint smell of medical marijuana. Surely it must be medical marijuana. To record. We'd like to thank Yair Lapid and Benjamin Netanyahu both, and say that it is so flattering, very, very flattering, but we simply can't join the coalition. We'd like to thank you, Elon, and you, Don, just for being news guys. We'd like to thank Tali Gourarier, the newest member of the Promise Podcast family, for teaching us our social skills. We'd like to thank you, the listener, and ask you to remember to like us on Facebook and to drop us a line, answer the questions that we're asking, get into the conversation. Also, go to iTunes, give us a 5-star review, something about us being the best thing that ever happened to the Jewish people. Those reviews do search engine magic, and they help us bring the show to others. But before you do that, let me thank you again for listening as you shovel the snow in Boston or soak up the sun in Sydney. And please join us again in 2 short weeks on this, The Promised Podcast.